Okay, so you know that feeling right when you check the news and it's like,
Sure.
oh, like you just get this unsettled vibe
Yeah.
lately. I don't know about you, but with the stock market kind of doing its whole roller coaster thing,
Yeah,
it's hard not to feel like you're on a little bit of shaky ground.
absolutely. Those days of the market dipping that we've been seeing consecutively
Yeah.
are definitely causing some concern, and it's totally understandable.
Right. And so that feeling, that sense of unease, is exactly what we are going to be diving into today. We're going to be taking a super close look at some of the statements that Donald Trump made on Truth Social recently
Okay.
about the economy, especially in the context of all this stock market activity that we've seen since like Monday and the couple work days leading up to it.
Yeah, we'll be looking at his specific claims, and then we'll compare those with the analysis that was presented in a recent YouTube video that we found from the Ring of Fire.
Mm-hmm.
And again, just to be clear, like we're not trying to pick sides or anything here.
Mm.
We're just really trying to break down what was said and understand the different ways that people are interpreting these events.
Exactly. Economic news can feel so overwhelming. Sometimes it's like trying to decipher a whole new language.
Yeah.
And so our goal in this deep dive is to kind of try to offer you some clarity, really dig into the details of these claims and the background so you can get a clearer picture
Awesome.
of what's actually being discussed.
So let's get to the substance of what Mr. Trump posted on Truth Social. And he stated, quote, "Oil prices are down. Interest rates are down. The slow-moving Fed should cut rates. Food prices are down. There is no inflation. And the long-time abused USA is bringing in billions of dollars a week from the abusing countries on tariffs that are already in place."
Okay. Wow.
He also mentioned that China
Yeah.
is raising their tariffs
Oh, wow.
by 34%. And he kind of warned abusing countries not to retaliate. And he also blamed our past leaders for the current economic situation.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
There is.
But let's start with interest rates, because that was one of the things he mentioned.
Okay.
He said that they are down, and it's interesting because the Ring of Fire video did say that interest rates are down a little bit.
Right.
But here's where the interpretations really start to diverge.
It's fascinating, right? Because you've got one piece of information,
Yeah.
a slight decrease in interest rates,
Yeah.
but it can be seen in such different lights.
Right.
So Trump is framing it positively, and it's likely because he's suggesting that this could potentially offer some relief to borrowers, and it could potentially help the economy.
Right.
However, the Ring of Fire views that same dip as really, really horrible for the economy right now.
Yeah, and they actually argue that this small decrease actually creates a recipe for disaster, specifically because of the inflation that we're still seeing.
Right.
So to understand their perspective, I think it's helpful to remember what happens when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, which they did under the Biden administration. So when we talk about the Federal Reserve's rate hikes, right, they're referring to the central bank increasing the benchmark interest rate,
Yeah.
which in turn makes borrowing more expensive and aims to cool down the economy and try to curb inflation.
Exactly.
Now, Ring of Fire is saying that those earlier rate hikes that were done were a necessary measure to try to get that inflation under control, to prevent these really significant inflationary pressures that we saw.
Right.
And so they're basically suggesting that lowering interest rates now, even a little bit while inflation is still a factor, could actually cause those pressures to start to intensify again.
Right.
And they explicitly state that food prices are not down and inflation is not none, directly contradicting one of Trump's key assertions.
Huge point of disagreement right off the bat, right?
Yeah.
Inflation,
Yeah.
he's saying it doesn't exist. The Ring of Fire is saying it does. And they're also saying that everyday costs like food haven't gone down.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty fundamental difference in how they are viewing this current economic landscape.
Right. It really highlights how the same economic realities can be interpreted through such different lenses. And that leads to completely opposite conclusions about, the overall health of the economy and the appropriateness of different policy responses.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to oil prices.
Okay.
Now, Trump says that they are down, and the video doesn't actually dispute that on the surface,
Right.
but their analysis provides like a really interesting contextual layer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they bring in this perspective from an environmental writer
Mm-hmm.
who they say has years of experience tracking gas prices.
Yeah.
And this expert points out that there are these predictable seasonal patterns at play.
Yeah.
And typically gas prices tend to decrease around this time of year because spring break travel has concluded.
Yeah, they specifically highlighted that there's usually a dip in prices between the end of that spring break travel period and before the major summer travel season kicks off, which usually happens around Memorial Day.
Right.
It's almost like the cyclical pattern that happens. And so it's not necessarily a result of any recent policy decisions.
Precisely. They're emphasizing that this isn't necessarily attributable to any specific administration's policies, but rather reflects basic principles of supply and demand in the market.
Yeah.
Just Econ 101, as they call it.
Right. So it's like the observation that oil prices are down might be factually correct.
Yeah.
But the video is kind of challenging the implication that this is some kind of significant victory or a sign of broader economic success
Right.
that can be credited to a particular leader.
Which I think reframes how you look at that piece of news.
Right. It does.
It's a good reminder that the economy isn't always a direct reflection of these immediate policy changes.
Yeah.
That there are these underlying rhythms, these established cycles that are at work.
And so that actually leads me to a question for you.
Okay.
How do we as informed individuals try to distinguish between the effects of specific policies
Right.
and these more predictable, cyclical economic behaviors?
Yeah.
It's not always a straightforward calculation.
No, it's not.
Okay, so let's move on to the topic of tariffs in China.
Okay.
Now, Trump talks about the U.S. bringing in billions of dollars from tariffs, and he mentions China increasing theirs by 34%, and he also issues a warning against retaliation.
The video acknowledges all those statements
Right.
regarding the reported increase by China. However, they then introduce a contrasting view regarding the impact that these trade measures are having,
Yeah.
particularly on the U.S. markets.
And this is where the two narratives really diverge again.
Big time.
The Ring of Fire video claims that the markets that are crashing are the ones here in the United States, and they're crashing because of Donald Trump.
That is their analysis.
Yeah.
And they're directly linking the downturn in U.S. markets to Mr. Trump's economic policies, and they present this as a direct contradiction to his narrative of economic success
Right.
and to the benefits of these tariffs.
So it's this whole situation where Trump is highlighting tariffs as this positive thing, like revenue flowing into the U.S. But the video's arguing that his overall economic approach, which includes these tariffs, is actually causing harm to the domestic market. And these are clearly like two very different interpretations with pretty significant implications.
Exactly, and it just underscores how complex international trade is.
Yeah.
And the fact that policies like tariffs can have these multifaceted consequences, some intended and some perhaps unintended,
Right.
which leads to these varying perspectives on their effectiveness.
All right, so let's take a minute and try to synthesize all these different viewpoints that we've been exploring.
Okay.
On the one side, we've got Trump declaring a form of economic success amidst a declining stock market, right?
Yeah.
He's pointing to lower oil and interest rates,
Yeah.
asserting that there's no inflation and emphasizing all this revenue generated by existing tariffs.
Right.
But then on the other side, we've got the Ring of Fire video presenting a largely opposing analysis on basically every single one of those points.
Yeah. I mean, they do concede that interest rates are slightly down and oil prices have decreased,
Right.
but they're attributing the oil price drop to these predictable seasonal factors.
Yeah.
And they're also arguing that the small interest rate decrease is actually a negative development given the current inflationary pressures.
Yeah, and they completely reject the claim of no inflation.
Right.
And they directly attribute the crashing U.S. markets to the economic policies that were enacted during Trump's presidency.
Big time.
It's a really stark contrast.
It is.
One side sees all these positive indicators and declares victory, and the other identifies worrying trends and places blame on past leadership. And this fundamental disagreement on the state and the future of the economy is really at the heart of these very different analyses.
And, that's ultimately what we wanted to unpack for you today.
Yeah,
To present these contrasting interpretations
right.
based on the information in these sources without injecting our own opinions or judgments.
Exactly, because I think being able to understand and navigate these kinds of conflicting narratives is such a crucial skill these days
Yes.
for staying informed in this super complex world.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in just one perspective, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's really important to be able to step back and consider these multiple viewpoints.
Absolutely. So as you're reflecting on all this information that we've talked about today, think about this. Given that some economic indicators naturally fluctuate based on predictable cycles, right?
Yeah.
How can we as individuals trying to make sense of the big picture best determine when a specific policy decision is having a real measurable impact
Right.
versus just like observing the normal ebb and flow of the market.
Exactly. It's like, how do you separate the signal from the noise
Yeah.
when it comes to the economy?
That's a really thought-provoking question.
I hope so.
To leave you with, so what new questions do you have about the relationship between statements made by political figures regarding the economy and then the often super complex and multifaceted realities of the economic landscape itself?
Yeah.
It's definitely something worth considering further.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See ya.